All week, as I was preparing the sermon for today, a song from the musical Hamilton kept playing through my mind. And the song is "The World Turned Upside Down." Now in Hamilton, that song marks the end of the Revolutionary War. But I was thinking, what a perfect song for the book of Acts. As the apostles are sent out with the story of Jesus, we hear in Acts how that story starts to change the world. As we look at today's scripture, our main preacher, Paul, has already had his world turned upside down by the risen Christ. This is the man who has the most dramatic conversion experience in the entire New Testament. And he makes a complete 180 in his life after he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. He goes from being a persecutor of Christians to arguably Christianity's most persistent church planter. He traveled thousands of miles at great personal cost in order to share the story of Jesus and his death and resurrection. And we encounter him today in church planting mode in the city of Thessalonica. And he's preaching in a synagogue and arguing that Jesus is the Messiah that the Jewish people have been waiting for. The problem is, not everyone was interested in having their world turned upside down, either by Paul or by Jesus either, quite honestly. They liked their religious life the way it was. So although you have some people who are converted, and you have believers that come to Paul from the synagogue, you have believers from the Greeks and Gentiles associated with the synagogue, but you have others who just don't appreciate this disruption. And they go so far as to stir up a mob to hunt for Paul and Silas. They attack the home of another believer named Jason. And then when they cannot find Paul and Silas, they bring Jason and a few other believers before the city authorities on trial. And surprisingly, this is their charge. These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here, and Jason has entertained them as guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus. Imagine that this is your synagogue. These people who have been accused were part of your synagogue. You have had this mob scene and a trial, and now your synagogue is associated with this charge of treason, of following another king. And this is a serious political charge. We didn't read verse 10 in this chapter, but it goes on to say that your visiting preachers, Paul and Silas, are in such danger that they have to get out of town in the middle of the night, and they head off for another city named Berea. It has been a wild couple of weeks at this synagogue in Thessalonica. Now, for our first reflection question, I want you to shift to our own situation and reflect either on your own or with someone else you're watching worship with this morning. What kinds of disruptions have we experienced in our churches over the past few weeks? How has COVID-19 turned the world upside down for our church? Of course, as a pastor, I can count so many ways. We are not worshiping in person today, and you may be able to be watching worship this morning in your pajamas. We are not seeing each other in person, and large groups are not gathering. We've started to see some small groups gathering over video, and people are bravely trying out new technologies for the first time. There is no coffee hour, no quilting groups, no exercise class. Our church calendars look a whole lot different than they did before. We're not doing mission and ministry in the same ways that we did. And it is incredibly difficult to plan when we are just not sure what it is we are planning for. And I get how painful this has been. I myself have had good days and bad days as I grapple with this incredible number of changes coming into my life all at once. It's hard to absorb. It's been hard to make sense of sometimes. And these adjustments are very taxing. I notice that my brain is not working to the level that I used to expect that it should. I forget more things. I make more mistakes. And there are also those days where I feel like a slug who has a great deal of difficulty getting myself off the couch and ending my watching of the internet news. But as I was sitting with this passage from Acts this week, here's what suddenly hit me. These disruptions that have turned our churches upside down would have been life as usual for this church in Thessalonica. They didn't have buildings, and we could see today how sharing space with the synagogue was not going to work long term. They didn't have a large congregation. There were only a few believers in the beginning. And sometimes they were afraid to gather because of persecution. So as we heard today, the mob went to Jason's house. They went to where he lived and attacked his home. So for many reasons, you would not have wanted to be publicly associated with this group of believers at times in early Christian history. And these little communities had no idea what the future held. They had never followed Jesus as a group before. It was all new to them, and they were making it up as they went. And yet, in the midst of these significant difficulties, it is little churches like this one in Thessalonica and all the other little churches that get planted. These are the places that are responsible for turning the world upside down. They started this movement that has lasted for 2,000 years, in which billions upon billions of lives have been changed, and our entire world has been reshaped. And we are seeing that it started out right here in these types of situations with these incredible difficulties. I now want to invite you to turn to your neighbor and reflect for yourself on this question. How did these small churches do it? How were they able to turn the world upside down? I would love to hear your answers to this question because I think we could have such an interesting discussion about it. For myself, I think that they changed the world one believer at a time, that it was that simple, that as one person decided to follow Jesus, that their actions and the way that they lived their life began to reflect Jesus and to share that love in the world. And from that one person, you started to see ripples of change. So it would have started with their immediate family members, their closest friends, and the people that they worked with. And if you had a community with even 10 people, you might see 10 times the amount of change. We sing a hymn in church that most of us know called "We Are the Church." And the first verse says, "The church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is a people." Even though we have sung this song, we have never lived it. And we are living this reality now. In this place, it is crystal clear to me that the power of the church and the life of the church lives within every individual follower of Jesus. Every person watching worship this morning, whether you're watching in your pajamas or not, every person praying, every person reading the Bible or gathering for Zoom Bible study, every person who asks the question, how might God use me right now? If you live a life with the love of God at the center, you are the church. So, church, as you look at the world, what do you see? Do you know someone who needs to hear a kind voice on the phone? If you call them, that is a call from the church. If you are seeing the news reports of food insecurity and it concerns you, and you have gardening skills, if you take a part of your garden and plant seeds that will later be used to send food to the food bank, that is church outreach. If you know someone who needs prayer, and you take a card and you write down that you are praying for that person, and better yet, write down what you are praying for them, that is also church outreach. And as we continue to see the justice issues revealed in the wake of this pandemic, the fact of our incredibly unequal access to healthcare, the ways in which the risks of this pandemic are not distributed evenly, but fall upon the most vulnerable, you might also find a way to advocate for justice. If you are the church, what do you do to spread the love of Jesus this week? Once you figure that out, let Pastor Kara and I know, so we'll get to hear what the church is up to. It's only our building that is closed right now. The church is alive and well. The love of Jesus and the spirit of the church lives on in every one of us. And we have everything we have ever needed to share the love of God in ways that can turn the world upside down. Amen.